schedules running a little late. We have a big agenda, and we know you all are very busy. I'm Felicia Marcus, Chair of the Board, and today is Wednesday, April 8th, 2015 at 9:18 in the morning. To my left is Vice Chair Franz Spivey Weber. To her left, Board Member Didi Diadamo. To my right, Board Member Tam Dodak. And to her right, Board Member Stephen Moore. Mr. Howard, will you introduce the staff that's assisting us today?
Yes, assisting the board today are Janine Townsend and Courtney Davis. To my left is Assistant Chief Counsel Phil Wiles. Michael Laufer is on vacation. To my right, Chief Deputy John Bishop. Karen is out talking about conservation, urban water conservation for all day, and will not be joining us.
And today is Jonathan's birthday. Happy birthday, Jonathan.
You know, if we weren't running late, I'd have us all burst into song. But because we're late, I'm going to dispense with that today.
Oh, not singing is your birthday present, Jonathan.
All right, exactly. For those of you who don't know this building, the emergency evacuation procedure is rather simple. Just look for the exit sign nearest you. If you hear an emergency sounding sound, it is, unless somebody has a really weird cell phone ring that they don't turn off. Just pick up your stuff, take your friends, proceed carefully out to Cesar Chavez Park. We gather near J and 10th. If you want to gather with us, you'll find out when the all clear comes to come back. You can obviously go wherever you would like. I also want to mention, as well, I mentioned it already, and that's why we're late, that the meeting is being webcast and recorded. What that means is, it's important anyway, but to set your sound-making devices on stun or to turn them off, please. That would be courteous. And then when you speak at the microphone, it's important to get close to it, not to touch it like a rock star, because it apparently for radio folks it creates static, but you need to get close enough that it can be picked up. That can be awkward to do, so we'll just remind you, and if you forget, Tam will remind you, as she will remind me if this thing doesn't work. I think that's it. With that, we're resuming our agenda, and I believe we're on to item 10. Who's going to introduce? You are, Mr. Borkovich.
Am I live? Good. Good morning, Chair Marcus, fellow board members. My name is John Borkovich. I'm the Chief of the Groundwater Monitoring and Assessment Section and DWQ here at the State Board. I'm pleased to present our experts that will be giving us an overview of scientific based information regarding groundwater monitoring for the SB4 or the well stimulation treatment legislation that passed in 2013. And the first speaker today will be Preston Jordan from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Our second speaker will be Dr. Bradley Esser from Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and Dr. Kim Taylor from the U.S. Geological Survey. And without further ado, Preston Jordan.
Thank you. It's an honor to address you today. And I guess I should start off, perhaps given what I read in the paper this morning, by saying my family uses about 35 gallons a person last summer.
Way to go. In the summer.
We're down to about 25 now, so.
Fantastic, thank you. It can
I think that almost should be a criteria of talking to you at this point. Pretty bad straits, pretty scary.
It's either that or you have to say saveourwater.com.
Yeah, okay, I like that. People get a get out of jail free card with that.
Right.
Yep. So the information I'll present to you today is primarily from the independent scientific review that was required by SB4, which was passed about a year and a half ago. The title seems all-encompassing, but it's really focused in on what it seems to be germane to you as a water board. And there's a little bit of a misnomer, which we're sort of forced to use, in that it talks about well stimulation, but really stimulation as defined in the bill has more to do with the rock beyond the well than the well itself. So it's increasing the permeability of the rock outside and around the well. Hopefully this works. So I only have my name on here. You'll see some other names further on. There's tens of people involved. So the team that's performed this review, California Council on Science and Technology, which you may or may not have heard of, is the first entity. It was established by the legislature as a nonprofit about 30 years ago, and it was established to advise the state on technical and scientific issues that relate to policy. Obviously, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory currently has about 5,000 employees, covers a wide range of scientific issues and endeavors, about $1 billion budget a year. The Earth Sciences Division, which I'm from, focuses on energy resources and environment in its research. There's a number of subcontractors. I'll just mention this one, which is the Pacific Institute, and I mention that specifically because they're a nonprofit water research institute, which the board, I believe, has worked with. I've seen some maps that are have a byline of both the board and the Pacific Institute. So they're responsible for a lot of what you'll see in this, and then there's a variety of other subcontractors I won't go into. That's a partial list of people that have been involved. These are the people that are involved mostly in the work that I'm presenting today. There's probably at least twice as many people who've been involved so far. So this is an outline. I won't go through it in detail, but basically I'll compare California hydraulic fracturing to hydraulic fracturing in other parts of the country. We'll talk about water use per operation, water use overall, constituents that are used in hydraulic fracturing in California, produced water disposal, and then some subsurface release mechanisms that are potential release mechanisms. If I get going too fast or you have any questions, please feel free to jump in. So these are the data sources we utilize. Again, I won't go into this in detail, but there are 7 different data sources. They each had their foibles and features, and we came to know them all quite well. Each of them provided us some different perspectives. But the key was that in integrating all these data sources together, we were able to get some perspective on how complete a picture we were able to get from these sources. Some of them were voluntary sources, some of them were mandatory sources. They cover different time periods, different aspects. We found that by integrating them all together, we could get a fairly complete picture that we thought was accurate, if not necessarily absolutely precise. That obviously will change going forward with the data that was coming in under SB4. However, at the time we were doing the majority of this work, which is from last summer until, well, around now, I've been turning in chapters this week. But we had to close the data frame last summer on most data sources, and so at that time, SB4 data, there wasn't much data that had been generated, so we had to use a lot of these other sources. So one of our recommendations is that some of this needs to be redone in 2 or 3 years when there's more SB4 data available and activities return to what you might characterize as more business as usual. So on the left here is a map showing the wells that are hydraulically fractured in the famous or infamous Bakken formation, depending upon your perspective, and also the Three Forks. And for scale or perspective, this is crossing from North Dakota into Montana. The border, the eastern border of Montana is about 500 kilometers, or about 300 miles. So you can see that area where those wells are installed is about 300 kilometers on a side, 200 miles on a side. So you compare that to California. This is where we're aware that wells have been stimulated in California. Obviously very different geographic distribution. Much smaller geographic area where hydraulically fractured wells have been installed in California. However, the amount of production over the last decade in both these areas, oil production, is about the same. So it's a very different situation between these two areas.
Oil production generally.
That's oil production, yeah. Maybe I can talk about gas production as well, but that's oil production. I mean, basically in California, there really isn't fracturing for gas production, and we don't think that there will be in the future. By and large, I mean, there might be an occasional fracture, but it's not going to be like what is going on in the Marcellus. So what is going on in the Bakken is represented in a cross-section schematically on the left side. And so they're fracturing source rock, which is the rock that had the organic material from which the oil is generated, and the oil is still in that rock. And that is the rock they're fracturing. It's thousands of meters deep. The layer itself is only tens of meters thick. And so they drill down and then along that layer for kilometer or kilometers. California, very different situation for where hydraulic fracturing has been occurring predominantly. In this case, the oil is oil that has migrated from that source rock to what's called a reservoir rock. So it's migrated into rocks that are plus or minus more permeable than that source rock. Up until the last 10 to 15 years, that's pretty much where all oil came from, was from migrated accumulations, not from source rock itself. So obviously as it's migrated upward, it's migrated to shallower depths. And so the wells are shallower. You can see they're hundreds of meters deep in that case. And there's also often not only production wells, but there's injection wells as well. So they might fracture an injection well and fracture a production well, inject water afterwards in the injection well to help promote flow of the oil to the production well as well as to control subsidence. There's also different styles of fracturing that are done in each of those geographies. Outside of California, most of what you read about in the media is horizontal, fracturing from horizontal wells, as was shown on the previous slide. And so this is looking down, if you will, and the well's running across. And in the source rock, the permeability is extremely low. And so the fracturing needs to create essentially an entire network that can allow the oil to flow to the well. See, it's represented schematically by that network of fractures. The formulations that are used are called slick water often, which is a different formulation than what's used in California. And it uses larger volumes of water because it has to create that entire fracture network. In contrast, in California, and again, this is looking down, the wells are vertical. That's why you just see that circle representing the well. And the goal is to create sort of one master fracture. And that's because the oil is migrated into these rocks. They're low permeability, but they're not very low permeability, which is maybe a fine distinction. But there's enough permeability that the goal is to create one master fracture to connect to the existing permeability out in the rock and allow the oil to come to the well. So that involves less water, different chemical formulation, simpler fractures. So what does that mean in terms of water usage in California in comparison? I need to define what operation means here. So operation is all the stages in a well. So operators will frequently fracture multiple intervals in the well. They'll fracture one, they'll plug off that part of the well, they'll fracture another interval and another interval. So an operation is all those stages put together. We don't say fracturing per well though, because occasionally some wells get refractured 10 years later. Not common at all, but it does happen. And so if you say fracturing per well, then the terminology gets a little confused. So we use this fracturing per operation. So this is a histogram of the water volume used per operation. On the horizontal axis is the volume per operation. The vertical axis is frequency. And I think you all are probably a little more familiar with acre feet, I would guess. So that's about 1.5 acre feet on the right side of this. And what's shown on this histogram is about 1,700 operations. There are some operations, larger volumes than 1.5 acre feet. But in order to be able to show you this distribution, the main part of the distribution, we left those off to the right. We could apply this on a log scale, but we thought for a public forum it would be more understandable if we plotted on a linear scale. So that's the California average. You can see that's actually above the median and the mode. That's because there's those outliers off to the right. But it's about a little under 1/5 of an acre foot. A half an acre foot per operation in the state. Now that compares to the operations in the Bakken area, which I was just talking about, which are over 3 acre feet per operation. So pretty big difference. Another feature you might read about is that New York State has put a moratorium or actually prohibited hydraulic fracturing. At least that's how it's stated in the media. It's not actually accurate. New York has prohibited high volume hydraulic fracturing, and it defines high volume as more than 300,000 gallons, or about an acre foot. And so while New York doesn't have a lot of fracturing at volumes less than that, it does have some, and they have not prohibited that. So if that type of moratorium was implemented in California, it wouldn't have much effect on 90% of the operations that occur here. And my bringing that up should not be taken as an endorsement or a suggestion that there should be a moratorium, but just from a policy perspective, since you're a policy group, I think it's important to understand that detail. So given those water volumes per operations, how many operations are there? This is bin by geography in sort of the first binning, with onshore in the left 3 columns and then offshore in the right 4 columns. I won't really go into offshore unless you want me to for some reason, but the onshore, there's 3 bins within onshore. There's hydraulic fracturing, matrix acidizing, acid fracturing. Hydraulic fracturing is in blue, frac packing, which I won't discuss in detail. Hydraulic fracturing is in red, frac packing is in blue, which I won't go into detail unless you want me to. Matrix acidizing green, acid fracturing, I don't even know what the color is because it's happens so infrequently that it's red. Okay. So our estimate from integrating all that data was there's about 125 to 175 hydraulic fracturing operations per month. That's looking back in sort of the historic period. If you look at the notices now, I think at the end of last summer it had risen back up to about that level. It had gone down dramatically with the implementation of the regulations, I think, because the sort of learning curve and how to get them permitted. And then I looked last night and it seems to have gone back down again, which may be due to the price of oil. Matrix acidizing, there's about 1/10 as many matrix acidizing operations given the data that we have as there are hydraulic fracturing operations. For that reason, I'm not really going to focus on those more in this talk. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can, or take them back to the team and get answers for you if you're interested in that. So where does hydraulic fracturing occur in the state? So this is the northern portion of the state, the Sacramento Basin in particular. You may or may not know that most of the hydrocarbons that are produced in the Sacramento Basin are gas, and this shows the gas fields in the Sacramento Basin. The colored fields are the ones where we have a report of hydraulic fracturing from some point over the last approximately decade, and the colors represent when the most recently reported hydraulic fracture took place. And so there's no reports that we identified of hydraulic fracturing taking place since 2011 in the Sacramento Basin. And even in the period before that, while these colors in these fields might make it look like there's a lot, I mean, we colored, if a field had one hydraulic fracturing event, then we colored the whole field. By and large, there were very few operations in the Sacramento Basin. So moving to central and southern California, obviously different story. This is where the oil is produced by and large in the state. The fields that are shown in red have recent hydraulic fracturing. And you can see in the San Joaquin Basin, and I'm sorry, I can't point, I wasn't prepared for that. So in the San Joaquin Valley, San Joaquin Basin, I mean, I can point, but I don't want you to have to turn around and follow the dot. In the San Joaquin Basin, obviously there's a lot of fields that have recent hydraulic fracturing, the Ventura Basin, the LA Basin. We didn't identify any recent reports of hydraulic fracturing in the Santa Maria Basin or the Coyama Basin or the Salinas Basin. However, the data that we had available was not quite as dense as it was for the other basins. So the next figure is going to zoom in on the southern San Joaquin Valley because that's where most of the hydraulic fracturing occurs in the state. And so there's a number of fields shown here, but 4 of these fields, Lost Hills, North and South Bell Ridge, and Elk Hills, have about 85% of the hydraulic fracturing that occurs in the state occurs in those 4 fields. Most of the matrix acidizing occurs in Elk Hills, Railroad Gap, and Buena Vista. That's why those are also on here. So there's a different map. The red dots show wells that we know or have reports that were hydraulically fractured. And this has, I believe, what are called your water resource planning areas overlaying on them. And you can see most of the stimulations occur in the semi-tropic planning area. And so if we look at the water use on average in that planning area and compare it to the water that is used for stimulation or for hydraulic fracturing, you can see it's 0.17%. So it's not very much water, which I think is important to emphasize because I read a lot in the newspaper, and I'm not sure the media really understands that.
And nor do I. So, have you seen in the most recent water plan, California water plan, a graph showing water use in California, and they have almost half of the water being used in California being used by essentially I won't say petroleum alone, but certainly by the oil industry. Does that?
That does that mean by the numbers I hear?
Exactly.
80% agriculture in terms of, there's all like different kinds of water, so I don't know which kind of water you're talking about.
I'm going to send it to you, and I would love for you to just sort of sort it through.
Yeah,
I don't
absolutely.
think it's necessarily wrong, but I just don't think it's clear.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, part of that might be, but again, 50% doesn't sound right, but just to emphasize, so this is water demand for making hydraulic fracturing fluids, and then also water demand for enhanced oil recovery, water flooding in pools that are predominantly hydraulically fractured. So we looked at both the direct use and the induced use, and you put both of those together, and it's still very small. That's a very small portion of the water that is used in the industry. I don't know if you're aware that most of the oil that's produced in California involves injecting steam. And for the most part, steam injection is not associated with hydraulic fracturing, so different pools. Now, most of the water they use for steam injection is not potable water that's supplied. They reuse the water that is produced with the oil. You may or may not know that most of what oil operators produce is water, not oil. I mean, more than 90% of what they produce is water. I mean, when I came to this, I realized it's really a sort of a fluid mining industry, and the water is the tailings, and the oil is the ore, and they have the tailings, and they dispose of the tailings. And one of the ways they do that is by reusing it for steam injection and other enhanced oil recovery methods. But as far as stimulation itself, the water demand is extremely low. Now, obviously, this is 0.17% in a quote-unquote normal year. Not that California really has normal years, but in a normal year. And it could be different now under a water-stressed year, but still a small percentage in context. So in terms of the water, how many constituents does the industry use in the water when it makes fracturing fluids? So per operation, it's under 30 different constituents that we identified per operation. So oftentimes you'll read there's hundreds, or you'll even see reports of thousands of different chemicals that are used. But if you look at a single hydraulic fracturing operation, typically the mix is under 30. If you look at the constituents across those 4 main fields that I mentioned, the number of constituents that we have reports for in a particular field across the field ranges from 70 to about 200. So the list is not maybe quite as enormous as sometimes represented. And if you look across the whole state, the data shows about 300 constituents.
Voluntarily disclosed. That's because that's the data you could get to.
Right. So at the time that we did this study, obviously it's no longer voluntary disclosure, it's mandatory disclosure. But at the time we did this study, I think there were only 185 completion reports that were available from DOGGR, and they were all from one field. And so we did not want to rely on that data. So this is relying on the voluntarily disclosed data, which goes back to 2011. And of those 300 constituents, about half were used in less than 1% of operations. So if you look at really the constituents that are used with any frequency at all, it's about 150, which makes it a little bit more manageable.
So somehow some operations use a more complex cocktail of chemicals.
Right, occasionally, yeah. But, very few. By and large, they have a recipe that they reapply over and over. And in part, that's because most hydraulic fracturing is occurring in those 4 fields, and they're doing it over and over and over again, and they've tuned it to what they know works. Now,
That's, going back to a previous slide, those are the gel-based type?
Yes,
matrix,
gel-based
as
fluids.
opposed to detergent-based that you see in the
Right,
rock. And
right, exactly. And there's a number of reasons for using the gel-based fluids. One of them is that they have higher viscosity, they carry more sand, carry sand more easily, and because they're trying to create just one master fracture that can really conduct oil from natural fractures and other permeability features that are out in the rock. They want to create a wider fracture with a good sand proppant packed, high transmissivity to get the oil back. There's other features. It's a whole engineering discipline, which if you're interested in that, I can certainly get you more answers. That's not my area of expertise. Going back to the voluntary...
Proppant is a new word.
Proppants, yes.
And is a proppant.
Yeah, and it's amazing. It comes from Wisconsin, which I was pretty amazed. They're really very, very particular about what they use because they spend a lot of money doing these operations, and so it makes, they want to get everything just right. As far as the voluntary nature of the disclosures, they're not all of the constituents are uniquely identified with what's called a CAS number, which is a way of identifying specific constituents. So there may be more constituents than 300. Some of what is submitted to the voluntary disclosure database, say confidential information, or it'll give a sort of a mix without being definitive. So there may be more, and that's part of the reason you'll need to reassess data in a couple of years, the mandatory data set. So some features of the constituents that we do know about, looked up information on how acutely toxic they are. And in using this word toxic, I don't want to say that the constituents are acutely toxic. We're looking at how acutely toxic they are. And that's defined by experiments exposing, various species to these compounds and constituents. On the left is the results from exposure to rats, and on the right to water fleas. And these pie charts are based on what's called the globally harmonized system, which is a sort of an international system for categorizing how acutely toxic a particular substance is. The lower the number, the more toxic. So you can see for rats, there were no constituents that we identified that were in the most toxic category, which would have been category number 1. There's very few in number 2, a few more in 3. So you can see all in all, the constituents that are used aren't in the most toxic range. For water fleas, it's a more even distribution. There's only 3 GHS categories for aquatic organisms, and they're fairly evenly distributed across those categories. Part of the big story here, though, is there's insufficient data. So a lot of the constituents, there has been no testing, at least not with information that's available in the public literature. So that's really an important data gap. We don't know how those constituents would perform in the environment should they get into the environment. So some other relevant properties on the left is biodegradability. So this is the propensity of a compound to break down or be transformed in the environment, either chemically or biologically. And you can see, again, big data gap. 2/3, we don't know no testing, or at least publicly available information on biodegradability. On the right, I won't go into too much detail, but it's a parameter that has to do with whether a constituent has more affinity for fats or hydrocarbons or water, which is another important parameter for a number of different aspects. About half we don't know that parameter. So, some pretty significant data gaps, and it would be useful to have those data gaps filled.
Oh, before we move on,
Sure.
I mean, that is, on this one, that's kind of a surrogate for chemicals that are likely to get taken up into tissue,
Right.
for instance, as a bioaccumulative potential. But another issue I'm sure my fellow board members are interested in too is the question of whether the chemicals have properties of constituents of emerging concerns, such as endocrine disrupting properties, other effects with response to bioanalytical techniques and responses in organisms. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the team, is really focusing on collecting data on these kind of more basic parameters, and that's like a whole nother domain, and finding that even these basic parameters aren't covered sort of suggests that those sort of next step parameters are probably even covered less, but we haven't looked at
Less
that.
of the pie.
Yeah, less of a pie, yeah. So that's water going in, if you will, to the ground. Looking at water coming back, you might see kind of a world of terminology here, which can get kind of confusing. SB4 defines flow back and recovered fluid, and you'll hear flow. You know, you hear those words used different ways. In California, those are really operational. So recovered water and flow back water is water that is captured from the well before it's put essentially on a pipeline, or before the fluids are coming out of it, or it's connected to a pipeline. And industry tends to collect very little of that water because it's expensive to handle that water. It's much cheaper to handle the water through the pipeline in the normal systems. So they minimize how much they capture as recovered water. And what they capture is mostly due to well conditioning, well clean out, that process. Most of what returns is returned as produced water. So produced water is the water that's produced with the oil. And there's no distinguishing between stimulation fluid returns and what we call formation water returns, or water that was actually in the formation before the stimulation occurred. They're commingled, they're co-managed, they really can't be distinguished.
Sorry, is that the stuff that ends up in sumps?
In part, you're being a great straight person for me here, because that's where we're going. So we looked at DOGGR's database and looked at the wells that we knew were hydraulically fractured. We looked at where that database coded the produced water as going to in the month after the fracturing event. And what those databases indicate is that most of that water goes to evaporation percolation ponds. About a quarter of it goes to subsurface injection. That could be either for enhanced oil recovery or disposal. And there is actually a category called other in the database, which we don't know what that means, but that's the code, is other. And then
Multiple small thermoses.
Yeah. And then there's not reported and surface water body. Important caveat on this is we've heard from some operators that in fact they are not disposing to specific operators, specific fields, that they actually aren't disposing to percolation ponds anymore, and that they will work to update the data, and that their business unit that submits the data to DOGGR is not coordinating with the field unit that's actually operating the field. And so there's actually the slice that is subsurface injection is larger, the slice that is evaporation percolation is smaller, but this is the public data we had, this is what we went with, we've included the caveats in our report. We don't know.
Remind me again, what is the volume that we're talking about on these percentages?
So the volume it's the water that is produced from a hydraulically fractured well in the first month after it goes on production. So I don't have an absolute number of how much water that is on here, but we felt that was the period that was more representative of when there might be stimulation fluid returns in that water. And so it was more important to know how that water in particular is disposed of with regard to well stimulation. So this is a block diagram. You've probably seen a lot of these, or you will see a lot of these, showing schematically operations and different possible release mechanisms. So this is a hydraulically fractured well that's started production. The water goes to a field separation system that separates the oil, gas, and water. And then from there, the water usually goes to a treatment plant for further treating. And from the treatment plant, it can be disposed of a variety of ways. As we talked about, it can be disposed of in percolation pits. And this is from the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board data mapped out of where there are unlined pits where produced water is potentially being disposed of. You can see some statistics on the side. There's about 1,000 of them. 60% of them are active, and about a third of the active ones are not permitted currently, so they're working hard on that, I know. And obviously that's a potential pathway for disposing of produced water that has stimulation returns in it to a percolation pond. Then that's a potential pathway for stimulation fluid to get to groundwater. Not saying that it is or isn't, it's just a potential release mechanism. Produced water from fractured fields is also used for irrigation. Now, I need to emphasize this is not from the fields where fracturing is a predominant practice, but there is at least one field we've identified where there's very occasional hydraulic fracturing events, and there is a permit for using the water for irrigation, and the water is used for irrigation. It goes to the Coelho Water District. Again, I want to emphasize, it's an occasional hydraulic fracture, but there is a connection from A to B potentially. So that's something that needs to be looked into further.
Yeah, and that's it gets treated, right?
Well, it gets treated, but our assessment, the treatment system that's used with its components, our assessment is that if there were hydraulic fracturing constituents in it, it is not designed to remove all of those constituents.
Okay, but so there's a process step.
Right.
It might be settling, it might be
sure.
something
right.
simple,
I mean, there's
or oxidation ditch type transformations, but nevertheless, it's this is something we could look at further.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oops. So this is one of the other ways to dispose of that I've mentioned is 2 disposal wells, and DOGGR is currently reviewing, as I'm sure you're aware, many of the water disposal injection wells. This map, the fields that have reported hydraulic fracturing sometime during the last decade are outlined in blue. The color in the field is the percentage of the underground injection disposal wells that are under review by DOGGR at this time. So I'm sorry I can't point, but there's a red colored field that's sort of southwest, and that's the Elk Hills field, and so you can see more than 90% of the wells are under review in that field. So should they determine that those wells should not have been injecting into that zone, then it's pretty likely that produced water that may have stimulation constituents were injected into that zone at some time in the past. So it's another potential release mechanism. Looking at subsurface release mechanisms, this is a cross-sectional view. And again, I want to emphasize potential release mechanisms because we don't have a lot of data in this area. It's an active area of research. For California, the only driving force for leakage is really during the fracturing event itself, because almost all of these fields are under what's called lift production. In other words, if you went out there and you open the well, oil's not going to come out of the well. You basically have to pump the oil up to the ground surface, which means the pressure in the field is pretty low. So the only time there's a pressure driving force is during the fracturing event. The fracturing events are fairly short. They tend to be an hour for each stage. But one potential release mechanism of the subsurface is if a hydraulic fracture encounters groundwater. Other parts of the country, that's not really a concern because of the thousands of meters of separation that was showed in an earlier slide. But in California, this is a histogram of the depth at the top of the fractured interval with depth across the bottom, frequency, the vertical axis. And you can see that most of the hydraulic fracturing in the state is fairly shallow. It's a few hundred meters. This map shows the field outlined in a color that represents the depth of the shallowest fracturing that we're aware of. The red outlines are less than 300 meters. So you can see there's a number of fields in the San Joaquin Basin that have that depth. And the colors behind that are groundwater quality by total dissolved solids. This is from the GeoTracker Gamma database, which is just a great resource that you all have put together, and I commend your staff for it. And so we just downloaded all the total dissolved solid data for all time from that database, and then took the minimum result from each 5 by 5 kilometer area and plotted that. And so you can see on the southwest portion of the San Joaquin Basin, there isn't much data because the water quality isn't real great there, and people aren't going to tend to put in wells and sample where there isn't great water quality. But however, there are still some squares where there are results of less than 500 milligrams per liter total dissolved solids. So that wasn't actually quite what I was expecting when I mapped this.
Right. There are a couple things you've said that are a little different than the prevailing narrative, just so I'm clear. One of them is this, that there are zones of water not that far away that have this is a very helpful slide. The other one is going back to that depth question, and I'm just wondering, when we talk about the reservoir rock, I can't remember what else you called it, the shallower, and that's why we use a different method here with less water, the gels, but producing more than's being produced in other areas where they have to go thousands of feet. That's very interesting. When there was that whole, it's not over, but a year or two ago, the discussion about the vast new resource of California, that whether you call it the Monterey or the Antelope Shale that goes across, that's deep, right?
Right.
And so the distinction people were saying was, it may be there, but
It's deep.
hold your horses, it's deep.
Yeah.
And it's different than this.
Right.
Just so that we understand what
Yeah.
we're dealing with, both in the short term and the potential.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Right, that's helpful.
Yeah, yeah. And I should emphasize again, now we just took all the data that was available, no quality checking. So, I think a little bit of skepticism is warranted, because, there may be a result from decades and decades ago in there of a low TDS in a particular area, and we don't know, we didn't look into the provenance of that data. So, look at this as an overview and more of a question to be pursued necessarily than absolutely the answer. So that was the release mechanism of hydraulic fracturing counting a groundwater aquifer. There's also concern about leakage potentially along the well that's being fractured itself, or an offset well if the fracture encounters or intersects that offset well. And so we've looked at that a bit. Again, I want to emphasize that the only time there's driving forces for leakage is really during the hydraulic fracturing event, by and large. It tends to last an hour per stage, tends to have about 1,000 gallons per minute that's injected, so that gives you sort of an upper bound on what could potentially leak. From data in other parts of the world, the Alberta Basin being the best one, regulators done a fantastic job of regulating their industry and collecting data and building a database. They find that about 1 out of 20 wells has detectable gas leakage, either from the well or from around the well. So you can look at that as sort of a bound on the lower, smaller leaks. But those leaks are so small that in terms of groundwater monitoring, if it was stimulation fluid that was leaking to groundwater, you would be hard-pressed to ever find them. At the other end, I mentioned the steam injection wells, so there's a data set regarding well blowouts, which is kind of an uncontrolled flow from a well, from steam wells in California, which are injection wells. And so we looked at the frequency with which a steam well blows out at the point at which injection starts, which is an analog for when hydraulic fracturing starts. Steam wells get injected for years and years and years, but if they blow out 5 years after they start, that's really not germane. What's germane to this analog is if they blow out right when the injection starts. It's about 1 out of 20,000. So obviously if something like that happened, one, the operator would know that was happening and shut down the operation. That could potentially release the amount of fluid that you would be able to detect in the ground surface eventually. So you kind of have these two end members, and then there's the domain in between, in which a lot of guesses can be made, but I wanted to give you sort of that bracketing. And then finally, faults. If a hydraulic fracture intersects a fault, that doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be flow. Faults in oil reservoirs are presumed to not be conductive, not allow fluid migration, because if they did, then there'd be no oil. The oil would be gone. So that's kind of the first step. So then the question is, well, if a hydraulic fracture intersects a fault, is it going to start opening that fault or causing movement in that fault that could allow leakage? In terms of the first part of that probability, the probability of intersection, the fault density in the San Joaquin Valley is large enough that it's likely there's tens of hydraulic fractures that intersect faults that are of sufficient extent that they might extend from the reservoir to a groundwater resource. Now again, that's not to say that there's flow along those faults, just that they're of great enough extent that they do pass from one to the other. That leaves this question of what happens when they're intersected, and that's an active area of research. I'd say there's no consensus on that at this point. So conclusions and needs: fairly little water use associated with stimulation in the state in context of state use as a whole, and in particular resource planning areas. Tens of constituents per operation, a couple hundred in use. So it should be possible to get kind of a corral around this and a better understanding over time. We do need environmentally relevant parameters measured for each of these constituents, which doesn't exist right now. So for a lot of them, it's hard to really say, even at kind of a basic level, what would happen if they were released into the environment. But the main concern really is produced water at this point that might contain stimulation constituents and how that's disposed, particularly obviously percolation ponds, but also these potential underground injection wells are under review. Both of those are release mechanisms. And finally, research is needed regarding propagation of shallow fractures. How far do they propagate? California, again, is different than the rest of the country. There is information from the rest of the country, but it'd be important to do that in California. That research, it could either be field research or it could be the operators providing the state data that could be assessed, because the operators collect tons of data, but they hold it as confidential for good reason. And then another area of research need is how faults respond to being intersected by fractures. Not so much in terms of earthquake hazard, but more in terms of do they open and provide flow paths. And it might be useful thinking about sort of the regional program and the research program going forward to both have sort of distributed monitoring, but try to work with operators to develop some focused monitoring areas where we could do more sort of process intense monitoring to get a better understanding of the basic processes. And with that, I thank you for your attention. Apologize to my colleagues. I went over, I think, a few minutes. I'm sorry about that. And I do have some slides about the Monterey Formation that you brought up. I sort of put that on the back end because I don't know how much that interest is, but I think our perspective is it's not likely to happen, and certainly within a decade time scale. And I can go into that more maybe after they talk, if you like.
Thank you. Thank you for shedding a lot of light where there's a lot of heat. That's helpful.
Thank you very much for your attention and good questions.
So I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Brad Esser. I'm at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And, SB4 required the state board develop model groundwater monitoring criteria. Groundwater monitoring was, one of the new regulations or new requirements of SB4 that was very different than how the oil and gas industry had been regulated prior to SB4. And in developing those criteria, it required the board seek the advice of experts, and the board chose Lawrence Livermore. So we are making recommendations to board staff, to members, and then board staff and members actually develop the model criteria. We're not doing this alone. We do have a variety of expertise at the laboratory. Joe Morris is a geophysicist who was recently worked for Schlumberger on hydrofracture. Vic Madrid is a hydrogeologist who also has worked for the oil and gas industry, a lot of experience there. Dr. Carroll has worked on monitoring for leakage from carbon sequestration, and you have a deep source. And then one of the challenges has been that the required scientific assessment of well stimulation in California is driven by the same kind of legislative deadlines that we're driven by. So to make sure that our recommendations were informed by that scientific assessment, we have contracted with Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. So, Dr. Preston, Dr. Stringfellow, Dr. Charu Varatharan, and Dr. Harry Beller. Dr. Jan Gillespie works extensively with industry. Dr. Jackson and Dr. Vengosh have been very active in actually looking at groundwater for evidence for impact. And then Dr. Beth Parker and Dr. John Cherry have a lot of expertise in transport. And this is, to a large extent, a transport issue. SB4 required, actually not just one monitor plan, but a number of monitor plans. There's a requirement for nearest neighbor monitoring. I won't talk about that today, but it asked the model criteria to address a range of spatial sample scales from well to well to regional. And our understanding is that the well by well is going to be what is required of the operator to get a groundwater monitoring plan approved by the board, and having that approval be necessary for being permitted to actually do a well stimulation operation.
And then the regional plan would be the responsibility of the water board, and it would apply to a groundwater basin that contains one or more oil and gas fields.
Just a quick one. Isn't the by well is on request, right? Or just, is that included?
No, that's the
Okay.
request is for nearby water well for a private property owner. This portion is for a requirement that the operator do groundwater monitoring associated with their well stimulation on either a well or group of wells.
But that's, it's spatial, like how close it is?
I'm not sure I'm understanding your question, I'm sorry.
Well, it's sort of well by well within a certain distance, right?
No, it's the well that they're talking about by well is stimulation wells. So it's associated with either one or more stimulation activities and a groundwater monitoring program associated around that.
Sorry, I was getting my wells mixed up.
And then there's the nearby water well is what you're thinking about, and that's required anytime a property owner asks.
And there is a process that the water board goes through, you know, the Central Valley Water Board, when they review DOGGR's application, and they evaluate whether there's protected groundwater or not.
So you're jumping the gun quite a bit, but there is two pieces here that we're talking about, and you'll hear some more of that after this presentation, which is what's going on now in the interim before the criteria is developed and what will happen after the criteria. Right now,